A room full of doctors signed her death certificate. A room full of lawyers had already divided her estate. And a janitor named Eddie was the only person in that entire building who refused to walk away. What he saw, what he noticed in a moment that everyone else had completely missed, did not just save one woman's life. It exposed something uncomfortable about who we choose to listen to and who we decide does not matter enough to hear. This is the story of Margaret Elaine Whitmore, one of the wealthiest women in Charleston, South Carolina. A woman who built a real estate empire from nothing, raised 3 children mostly alone, donated millions to hospitals and schools across the state, and was, by every medical and legal standard, available, declared dead on a Tuesday morning in September. And this is the story of Eddie Chambers, 51 years old, 17 years working as a janitor at Gracewood Funeral Home in Charleston. A man who most people in that building walked past without making eye contact. A man whose name the director of the funeral home could not have told you without checking a file. A man who looked at Margaret Whitmore lying in her open casket during a private family viewing and thought, something is not right. What happened in the next 40 minutes is something that the medical community still uses as a case study in a phenomenon called Lazarus syndrome. And what happened in the years after that is a story about what it actually means to matter, to be seen, to be heard, and to be the kind of person who pays attention when everyone else has already moved on. Stay right here, because this one is going to change how you look at the people around you. Let's start with Margaret, because you need to know who she was before you can understand what almost happened to her. Margaret Elaine Whitmore was 72 years old when this story takes place. She had grown up poor in rural South Carolina, the kind of poor where you eat what you grow and you wear what gets handed down, and you learn very early that the world does not owe you anything. Her father worked in a textile mill. Her mother cleaned houses. Margaret watched both of them work themselves to exhaustion for their whole lives, and she made herself a promise at 15 years old that she was going to build something different. She did, through sheer force of will and a mind that could read a real estate deal the way most people read a menu. Quickly, clearly, knowing exactly what she wanted, she built Whitmore Property Group from a single rental house she bought at 26 into a company, managing over 300 commercial and residential properties across South Carolina and Georgia. By the time she was 60, she was worth somewhere north of $200 million. She was also, by most accounts, not the warmest person you would ever meet. Sharp, demanding, brilliant. She had high standards for everyone around her and made no apologies for that. Her 3 children, William, Diana, and Robert, had grown up in the shadow of a mother who was always working, always building, always 5 steps ahead of everyone in the room. They loved her. They also found her exhausting. They also stood to inherit a great deal when she was gone. That last part matters. Remember it. In the spring of the year this story takes place, Margaret had a massive cardiac event. She collapsed at her desk on a Wednesday afternoon and was rushed to Charleston Medical Center, where the emergency team worked on her for a long time. She was stabilized. She spent 3 weeks in the ICU. She came home with a modified pacemaker, a long list of medications, a strict diet she immediately ignored, and a cardiologist named Dr. Frank Harmon, who visited her weekly and tracked her recovery carefully. For about 4 months, she did well. Not great, but well. She was Margaret. She pushed herself, ignored rest recommendations, took calls during what were supposed to be rest periods, and treated her recovery the way she treated everything else, which was as an obstacle to get through as fast as possible. Then in September, she had a second event. This one happened at home. Her housekeeper found her unresponsive in the study at 7 a.m. Paramedics were called. They worked on her for 23 minutes. At 7:31 a.m., Margaret Elaine Whitmore was pronounced dead. Dr. Harmon was notified. He came to the house, examined her, and confirmed the pronouncement. Death certificate was signed. The cause listed as cardiac arrest secondary to known heart disease. By noon, the Whitmore family had been notified. By 3 p.m., the family's estate attorneys were already in motion. By 5 p.m., Gracewood Funeral Home had received Margaret's body, and Eddie Chambers had been asked to prepare the viewing room for a private family service the following morning. Now let me tell you about Eddie. Eddie Chambers was born and raised in North Charleston. He was the second of 4 kids. His dad worked construction. His mom worked at a laundromat and later became a home health aide. Eddie had wanted to be a mechanic when he was young. He was good with his hands, good at figuring out how things worked, good at spotting when something was off just by the sound or the feel of it. Life took different turns. He worked a series of jobs in his 20s and 30s, factory work, warehouse work, a stretch driving for a logistics company. He was not a person the world had handed things to. He was a person who showed up, did the work, and went home. He had a daughter named Tanya who was 26 and worked at a pharmacy. He had a small apartment he kept clean, and a garden out back he was very proud of, and a habit of noticing things that most people did not notice. That last part is important. Eddie had been at Gracewood for 17 years. He had seen thousands of deceased people pass through that building. He was not a mortician. He was not a doctor. He had no formal medical training of any kind. But 17 years of working in a funeral home does something to a person. You learn what death looks like. You learn what the absence of life looks and feels like in a room. You develop a sense for it the way a baker develops a sense for when bread is ready. Not from reading about it, but from being around it every single day for years. Eddie set up the viewing room that evening. White lilies. Margaret's family had requested white lilies. The casket was a mahogany piece, top of the line. The kind families order when money is not the concern. Eddie arranged the flowers, adjusted the lighting, set out the chairs for the family. He did his job the way he always did it, quietly, carefully, completely. And then he walked past the casket on his way out. He stopped. He stood there for a moment and looked at Margaret Whitmore's face. Something was wrong. He could not have told you exactly what it was if you had asked him right then. It was not one specific thing. It was a collection of very small things that his 17 years of experience had trained him to notice without consciously cataloging. The color of her skin was slightly off in a way he had seen before, but not quite like this. There was something about the way her chest sat that did not settle with him. And there was something around her lips, the faintest, almost imperceptible thing, that made him lean slightly closer. He stood there for a full minute just looking. Then he went and found the funeral home director, a man named Gerald Webb, and said, "Mr. Webb, I think you need to come look at Mrs. Whitmore." Gerald Webb was 58 years old, had been in the funeral business for 30 years, and had a great deal of confidence in his professional expertise and not a great deal of patience for being pulled away from his desk by his maintenance staff. He looked at Eddie for a moment, with the expression of a man who is deciding whether this is worth his time. He decided it probably was not. He said, "Eddie, she was examined by her physician and the responding paramedics. She has a signed death certificate. What exactly are you concerned about?" Eddie said, "I don't know how to explain it. Mr. Webb, I just think something doesn't look right." Gerald looked at him. Then he said, "Finish up the room. The family is coming at 9 tomorrow morning." And he went back to his office. Eddie stood in the hallway for a moment. He went back to the viewing room. He stood at the casket again. He took out his phone and looked up the funeral home's contact for the attending physician on record, Dr. Frank Harmon. He found a general number for Dr. Harmon's practice and called it, knowing full well it was after hours and nobody would answer. Nobody answered. Eddie put his phone in his pocket. He looked at Margaret Whitmore. He thought about his mother, who had been a home health aide for 20 years and who had told him once, "Always trust what your body is telling you about another body, because the body knows before the brain catches up." He went back to Gerald Webb's office. He knocked on the door and said, "Mr. Webb, I'm sorry to bother you again, but I cannot leave this alone. I need someone with medical knowledge to look at her before tomorrow morning. I know that probably sounds crazy. I know I'm the janitor. But I've been doing this for 17 years, and something is not right in that room." Gerald Webb looked at him for a long moment. And here is the part of this story that I want you to hold on to, because it matters enormously. Gerald Webb, to his enormous credit, to a credit that he will carry for the rest of his life, made a decision in that moment to take the word of the man who cleaned his floors over his own professional certainty. He called the on-call medical examiner. Dr. Patricia Sands arrived at Gracewood Funeral Home at 9:47 p.m. She was not happy about it. She made that fairly clear. She was professional about her unhappiness, but it was present. She came in, snapped on gloves, and began a brief examination of Margaret Whitmore, mostly to confirm what everyone already knew, so that the janitor could be thanked for his concern, and everyone could go home. She checked for pulse. Standard. She checked pupil response. Standard. Then she placed 2 fingers very carefully on Margaret's neck. She held them there for 5 seconds. She moved them slightly. She held them there for another 5 seconds. She turned and looked at Gerald Webb and said, "Call 911. Right now." Margaret Whitmore had a pulse. It was faint. It was irregular. It was the kind of pulse that a rushed examination at a scene of an apparent cardiac death could absolutely miss, and had twice, by trained professionals that morning. But it was there, beating, quietly, stubbornly, the way Margaret Whitmore had done everything her entire life. What had happened, the medical team later determined, was a phenomenon called Lazarus syndrome, named after the biblical figure raised from the dead, which is a documented but rare medical occurrence where the heart spontaneously restarts after CPR has stopped, sometimes minutes later, sometimes hours later. It is real. It is recognized by the medical community. A 2020 review in the journal Resuscitation documented 65 confirmed cases of Lazarus syndrome globally, and medical experts believe it is significantly underreported because in most cases, nobody checks. Nobody checks because the death certificate has already been signed, because the doctor has already confirmed it, because the body has already been moved, because everyone in the room has already accepted what they were told and moved on. Except Eddie. Paramedics arrived at Gracewood at 9:58 p.m. They stabilized Margaret and transported her to Charleston Medical Center. She was admitted to the ICU. She was placed on monitoring equipment that tracked her heart through the night. She was alive. The Whitmore family received a phone call at 10:30 p.m. that I genuinely cannot imagine receiving. William, the eldest, later said in an interview that when the hospital told him his mother was alive, he sat down on the kitchen floor and stayed there for about 10 minutes because his legs simply stopped working. Diana drove straight to the hospital and did not leave for 4 days. Robert, the youngest, called Eddie Chambers directly. He had gotten the number from Gerald Webb and could barely get through a sentence without his voice breaking. Margaret spent 11 days in the ICU. She had 2 more procedures. Her pacemaker was recalibrated. Her medications were adjusted. The medical team that treated her the second time was more aggressive, more thorough, and considerably more motivated by the awareness that they were dealing with a woman who had already defied what everyone thought was the end. She went home in October, and 6 weeks after she went home, Margaret Whitmore, who was known for being sharp and demanding and not particularly sentimental, asked her assistant to find out everything there was to know about the janitor at Gracewood Funeral Home named Eddie Chambers. She learned about Tanya, his daughter, at the pharmacy. She learned about the apartment in North Charleston and the garden he was proud of. She learned that Eddie had been making $16 an hour for 17 years and had never once received a formal commendation for anything. Margaret called her estate attorney. She made some changes. Then she called Gerald Webb and asked for Eddie's phone number. Eddie picked up on the third ring. Margaret said, "Mr. Chambers, this is Margaret Whitmore. I understand you're the reason I'm making this phone call instead of being in the ground." Eddie was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I just thought something wasn't right, ma'am. I couldn't walk away from it." Margaret said, "No, you couldn't. And I need you to know that I am going to spend whatever time I have left making sure the world knows that the most important person in that building on that night was not the doctor or the director or anyone with a title. It was you." She paused. Then she said something that Eddie has repeated in every interview he has given since, because it landed in him like something he had needed to hear for a long time without knowing it. She said, "The people who actually see the world clearly are almost never the ones standing at the front of the room. They are usually the ones everyone else is walking past. I should have known that. I spent my whole life walking past people like you. I will not do it again." Margaret Whitmore lived for 4 more years after that September night. She used those 4 years the way a person uses time when they understand clearly that it is borrowed. She restructured her estate to include significant endowments to workforce training programs across South Carolina. She set up a scholarship in her name, specifically for working adults returning to education. She funded a medical research grant into Lazarus syndrome at the Medical University of South Carolina, pushing for better protocols around post-mortem examination windows. And she made sure that Eddie Chambers never had to worry about money again. Not in a flashy way. Not in a way that made the news right away or turned him into a spectacle. In a quiet, practical, Margaret Whitmore way. A house in a better part of North Charleston that he now owned outright. A fund set up for Tanya's future. A salary continuation. Arrangement through Gracewood. That Gerald Webb agreed to. Immediately and enthusiastically. Eddie still went to work at Gracewood every day until he chose to retire. Not because he had to. Because it was his place. Because he had spent 17 years learning how to see something that no one else could see in that building, and that knowledge felt. He retired at 56. He has a bigger garden now. At Margaret's funeral, her real one, for years later, attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. Eddie sat in the front row, not at the back, not off to the side, right at the front where the family sat, because that was where Margaret had specifically requested he be placed. William Whitmore stood at the podium and told the story that everyone in Charleston already knew by then. And at the end of it, he looked at Eddie sitting in the front row and said, "My mother used to say that the most dangerous thing in the world is a room full of confident people who have stopped paying attention." She said Eddie Chambers taught her that. She said he was the most important person she ever met. And knowing my mother, that is not a statement she made lightly. The room was completely silent. Eddie sat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes forward, and he thought about a Tuesday night in September when he walked past a casket and stopped because something in 17 years of quiet, invisible, underappreciated experience told him to stop. He had no degree, no title, no power, no position in that room that gave anyone any reason to listen to him. He spoke anyway. He went back anyway. He pushed anyway. Because some things are too important to walk away from just because nobody expects you to say anything. Because sometimes the person standing at the back of the room is the only one seeing clearly. Because the world does not always reward the people who are paying attention. But occasionally, in the most unexpected and profound way, it does. Eddie Chambers cleaned floors for 17 years. And one September night, he used everything those 17 years had given him to save a life that every credentialed, titled, qualified person in the building had already given up on. That is not a small thing. That is everything.